Thessaly looks harmless in a wide shot. Open farmland, low hills, wind moving through fields, sheep crossing the grass as if nothing important ever happened here. But that calm is a surface treatment. This land doesn't only grow crops, it grows power, then buries it, then lets it return wearing a different face. If you want a number to ruin the postcard, here it is. One hill, more than 1,000 years, multiple takeovers. And with every takeover, the past gets edited. A fortification rises, a city expands, contracts, vanishes, returns. A tiled roof collapses like a court record being torn in half. And then, on the same slope, someone cuts graves into the soil, as if to say, from now on, this place belongs to us. And that leads to the big question of this story, the question empires hate, because it turns archaeology into an accusation. When power dies, who inherits the ground, and who gets to rewrite the dead? Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. We're at Vlochos, in the plains of Thessaly. From a distance, you can already see the first thing empires love to build. A wall. Not a wall that merely defends. This is a wall that performs. Stones so large, they send a simple message to anyone living below. I will outlast you. I am stronger than your doubt. And if you want peace, learn to believe that. But archaeology doesn't believe walls. Archaeology believes layers. So an international team keeps returning here, year after year. They don't begin with shovels. They begin with instruments, magnetometry and resistivity, modern ways of listening before touching. The results are seductive. At the base of the hill, traces of a planned urban layout, streets, buildings, a clean classical grid. It whispers, Hellenistic city, the era when Greek power dressed itself in geometry, turned control into order and called it civilization. And then the site reveals what makes it dangerous. Vlochos doesn't have a securely identified name. Other Thessalian sites can be pinned to ancient records. This one, so far, resists. And a city without a name isn't just mysterious, it's convenient. Because when a place is unnamed, nobody has to answer for how it disappeared. A nameless city is where erasure becomes easy, where accountability dissolves. So, they dig. Trench 1 is the cold method. Follow stratigraphy downward. Peel time back layer by layer like a sealed file. The goal is simple and brutal. What came first? What was reused? What was destroyed? What was built over the wreckage? Trench 2 is the temptation. It sits on a steep slope, aimed at the strongest geophysical anomaly, a monumental-looking rectangle that makes everyone want to believe in a terrace, a shrine, maybe a temple, something that would explain why a city chose this hill at all. And notice our own psychology here. We want temples. Temples make the past feel meaningful, ordered, elevated, worthy. But the ground has no obligation to flatter us. Because this is the oldest lesson of power, the past shows up in the shape you least want. Instruments can be accurate on a plan and still lie about depth. A city grid can be real and still belong to a later phase. A temple can be nothing but collapse, followed by a grave. And the moment you find a burial where you expected a monument, the story changes species. It stops being about how great the city once was. It becomes about ownership. Who gets to claim this slope? Who gets to call it sacred? Who gets to place their dead on top of someone else's past and say, quietly but decisively, the new world has arrived, and the old one is now just foundation. That's when Vlochos stops being a site. It becomes a 1,000-year dispute between walls that perform, roofs that collapse, and bones that refuse to stay silent. Here's what makes Vlochos more unsettling than a lost city headline. It isn't lost. It's right there. You can see the hill. You can touch the wall. You can walk what feels like a street. The landscape is practically begging to be identified. And yet, the one thing that turns ruins into history, the one thing that forces accountability, still won't sit still in your hands. A name. In Thessaly, that matters. Because this region wasn't an empty backdrop for Athens and Sparta to posture against. It had its own federations, its own city rivalries, its own loyalties traded like currency. And Vlochos sits in the middle of that world, one of several urban centers spread across the plain. Yet, it remains stubbornly unsecured in the record. Other sites have been confidently linked to known ancient cities, stitched into the written tradition. This one hasn't. Not because nothing happened here, but because the evidence hasn't given the final permission slip. And when a place stays unnamed, something ugly becomes possible. You can romanticize it. You can treat it like scenery. You can talk about ancient Greece as if it were marble and philosophy, not administration and coercion. A nameless city is the dreamland of propaganda, because no one has to say which council taxed the farmers, which magistrate enforced the rules, which faction cut deals, which families profited. The dead are reduced to atmosphere. That's why the team keeps coming back. Not for the thrill of finding a temple, but for a more dangerous goal, to pin this hill to a timeline that can't be argued away. And they do it the way the ground demands, by refusing the temptation of a single story. The site is layered, not linear. There's at least 1,000 years of activity around this hill, from roughly the Archaic period onward into the early medieval era. But it isn't continuous. It expands, contracts, shifts its boundaries, and most damningly, goes quiet for long stretches. That's not a fun mystery. That's what it looks like. When systems fail, when populations move, when someone decides a place is no longer worth defending, feeding, or governing. Empires don't just conquer, they also abandon. And abandonment is its own kind of violence, because it turns cities into quarries, memories into building material. So the project doesn't pretend it already knows what it's looking at. It starts with surveys, with geophysics that reveals a ghost map of the buried city, magnetometry tracing outlines, resistivity sharpening what magnetism blurs. And yes, last season was frustrating. Bad weather, results that didn't quite land. The kind of season that humbles you, because the Earth is not a cooperative witness. But they return anyway, because persistence is how you force the past to testify. They mark out trenches with GPS like they're drawing a cross-examination grid over the plain, and they state what they think they have. 4 broad phases: Archaic, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine. Then immediately add the important clause, not continuous occupation. That's the key. The site isn't a single Greek city. It's a revolving door of power, each phase inheriting the bones of the previous one and pretending it started from clean ground. Before they even break into deeper archaeology, the surface starts leaking clues. Not the glamorous kind, not statues with inscriptions that make historians purr. Just a small object that nevertheless carries a political fingerprint, a bronze coin. On one side, Apollo's head, on the other, Athena in martial posture, spear and shield, with an inscription naming the League of the Thessalians. Federal coinage, identity struck in metal. A reminder that this landscape was organized, claimed, not only by walls but by institutions. Coins are not just money, they're miniatures of obedience. They say, "This is who rules here. This is who you belong to. This is whose gods you are allowed to see on your war palm." And the date range attached to this coin doesn't just place it in the Hellenistic period. It places it in a time when belonging was contested, negotiated, and enforced through networks, mints, markets, military commanders, leagues. The coin tells you something brutally simple. People here were not living in a myth. They were living under systems. And here's the confrontation the soil quietly offers. If identity can be minted so precisely, why is the city itself still unnamed? Because names don't survive by accident. They survive when someone keeps copying them, when administrators keep writing, when elites keep funding, when the state keeps caring. Lose the bureaucracy, lose the archives, lose the tax structure that demands receipts, and your name becomes optional. That's what collapse does. It doesn't only break roofs, it breaks continuity. So the dig becomes a hunt for the kind of evidence that doesn't care about storytelling. Roof tiles with stamps, maker's marks, inscriptions that can anchor a site to a name known from records. In nearby places, a single fragment with a partial city name has helped confirm an identification. That's why everyone secretly dreams of letters. Letters are power. Letters are ownership. Letters make the past legally recognizable. And now you can feel the tension tightening. They have weeks, not days. They have tools that can see through soil. They have a city plan whispering from below. They have a wall that performs dominance from above. They even have a coin that proves the region's political machinery was active. And yet the hill keeps its most valuable secret behind the simplest defense: silence. So, as trench edges are cut and the first layers are cleared, the question stops being, what will we find? It becomes, what will the ground allow us to name? Because once you name a city, you don't just locate it. You resurrect responsibilities. And not every past wants that. To understand Vlochos, you don't start in a trench. You start with your lungs. Because the hill forces you to climb the argument. The road up isn't a casual path worn by goats. It's engineered, stone-heavy, switch-backing, a deliberate ribbon of effort that drags a body upward and teaches it a lesson before you even reach the top. This place was designed to be approached, to be seen, to be felt. Some stones along that monumental terrace road are so big they stop being construction and become theatre. Function is there, sure, but display is the point. You don't stack 2-meter blocks because you're merely worried. You stack them because you want the plane to watch you stack them. And then, the wall arrives like a verdict. It wraps the crest in a massive circuit, kilometers of fortification that, from a distance, looks like a crown, and up close, looks like a warning. The temptation is to talk about defense, to imagine enemies and arrows and heroic last stands. But that's the romantic translation. The political translation is colder. Walls don't just keep people out. They keep people in line. They create a permanent visual hierarchy, top and bottom, inside and outside, protected and exposed. They don't only resist violence, they manufacture inevitability. This is how power gets built into landscape, not by speeches, but by stone that can be seen for miles. The team's working sequence, based on visible architecture, survey, and excavation, suggests multiple major phases here, separated by gaps. An early fortified hilltop seems to belong to the late archaic, early classical horizon, sometimes loosely anchored around the era of the Persian Wars. But even that is instructive. The point is not a neat date pinned on a museum label. The point is the logic. A large hill fort appears at a time when Greek communities are learning what it means to live under pressure. Regional conflict, shifting alliances, the need to signal strength before the enemy even arrives. A hilltop enclosure with little sign of interior structures can be more than a town. It can be a refuge, a rally point, a statement. We can hold this high ground, and we will. Then, later, around the late 4th century BCE, the story shifts downhill. The surveys on the flat below the slope reveal what looks like an organized urban plan. Streets, building blocks, the kind of grid that belongs to a world that wants to be legible. If the early hill fort is emergency power, power in armor, the later city is administrative power, taxation, markets, property boundaries, civic order. And to protect that new urban reality, the fortification system expands. The walls don't just ring the summit. They reach out, enclosing slopes, wrapping the settlement like arms. That image matters because it reveals intent. This isn't only about safety. It's about control of movement. Who enters, who exits, what gets seen, what gets taxed, what gets stored. Now add the part people usually skip when they fetishize ancient cities: logistics. A city like this isn't sustained by grandeur. It's sustained by supply, water management, food storage, labor organization, repair. Fortifications are expensive, not once, but forever. They demand maintenance, manpower, and political will. And that's where the hill becomes cruelly honest. There are gaps. Periods when the system seems to thin or vanish, when the place contracts or is abandoned. That's not just decline. That's a failure of governance. Because when the administrative machine can't justify the cost, can't extract enough surplus, can't guarantee stability, walls turn from protection into burden. And abandoned walls don't keep anyone safe. They become quarries for the next regime. Between those phases, the site hints at a Roman presence. Structures at the base, detectable in the geophysics, suggesting another layer of occupation. But the most psychologically revealing phase may be the later one, the Justinianic era and the centuries after. The evidence points to a fortified contraction, defenses focusing on a smaller zone, a reduced footprint, a different kind of survival. That aligns with a wider truth of late antiquity. When imperial reach strains, power stops pretending it can cover everything. It starts choosing what to save. And here's the confrontation. Every time the footprint shrinks, someone is being written out. Not because they died dramatically, but because their lives stopped being worth the state's accounting. The hill teaches you that history is often just the record of what remained funded. Standing on the summit, you feel why people kept coming back. The view is domination. On misty days, you're above the clouds, and the wall hides the slope behind you, making the top feel like a floating disc. Surreal, almost religious, even without a temple. That sensation is not a side detail. It's the psychological fuel of power, the feeling that your position is natural, elevated, chosen. And that's exactly why Trench 2 matters. Because geophysics has marked a strong anomaly on the hillside. Rectangular, monumental, the kind of signal that tempts everyone toward the same word. Sanctuary, shrine, temple, a ritual complex overlooking the city below. It fits the logic of place, high visibility, controlled approach, the emotional geometry of authority. But if you've learned anything from this hill, it's this. Vlochos doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what it can prove. And the moment they cut into that slope, the question stops being, is it a temple? The real question sharpens into something more dangerous. If this was a sacred platform, who maintained it? And what did it cost the people living in its shadow? There is a modern fantasy we don't admit out loud, that technology can save us from ambiguity, that if we scan a landscape hard enough, if we throw enough sensors at it, the past will finally present itself cleanly, like a diagram in a textbook. Vlochos punishes that fantasy, because geophysics is seductive precisely because it looks like certainty. Magnetometry draws lines where you want streets to be. Resistivity sharpens edges where you want walls to stand. Ground-penetrating radar gives you depth slices that feel almost like seeing through skin. On a screen, the city is already there, neat, legible, obedient. And you can feel the psychological trap. Once you've seen a grid, you start believing the grid. You start narrating before you've earned the right. But the Earth doesn't care what your software promised. The team says it plainly. Last season, the geophysics worked incredibly well, and still tricked them. Not in X and Y. The plan was right. The where was right. The seduction was honest on the surface. The lie was in Z, depth, sequence, phasing. The difference between this building belongs to the Hellenistic city and this building is a later intruder isn't a small correction. It changes the political story of the site. It changes who you imagine living here, who you imagine ruling here, and what you think decline even means. So the excavation begins with a kind of humility that most grand historical narratives never bother with, the willingness to be wrong in public. Trench 1 is reopened, 5 by 5 meters, a small square of violence against 1,000 years. The goal is not glamorous, it's procedural. Follow the stratigraphy all the way down. Find original levels. Untangle phasing. Because Vlochos isn't one city. It's multiple cities, stacked like arguments, each trying to claim the same ground as if it were unowned. At first, the trench was chosen because geophysics showed an off-grid structure, something that didn't fit the expected classical layout. That alone is a warning. Off-grid often means later. It can mean reuse, encroachment, the city's plan being bent by a new phase that doesn't respect old rules. And when surface finds already show material from widely separated periods, fragments 1,000 years apart within meters, then the trench isn't just a window. It's a courtroom. Every layer is a witness that might contradict the one above it. Then the first major humiliation arrives. They thought they were targeting something older than late classical or Hellenistic. What they got was a building that looked nice and rectangular in the data, 2 rooms, clear outline, and it seemed to sit under the classical grid. Except it didn't. It sat above it. Later, not earlier. And not just later. Later by a moral distance that matters. Because the pottery from backfill and last use points to around the 8th century. Around 800 CE. That's not a small shift. That's the difference between a world of city-states and leagues, and a world where Byzantine authority is thinning, where settlements shrink, where people are living in a landscape that once held empires and now holds something more fragile, households. This is where the story stops being ancient Greece and becomes something more confronting, the afterlife of a city, the long tale of collapse, the era that gets treated like a footnote because it doesn't produce marble statues, but it produces the most honest evidence of survival. Building one begins in the 6th century CE, early Byzantine, apparently as a single-room structure, likely mud brick with a tiled roof. Then it's abandoned and decays. A century or so later, new inhabitants reuse its foundations and add a second room. That change matters. It's not just architecture. It's a clue about how people relate to ruins. Reusing a foundation is a rational act. It's economic. It's also psychological. It says, the old city is not dead stone. It's a resource. When political systems weaken, people stop building symbols and start building shelter. They scavenge. They adapt. They occupy the gaps left behind by states that no longer bother to govern fully. And the roof tells the same story. In the later phase, the lack of roof tiles in the backfill suggests the enlarged building might have been thatched. Thatched. Not because people were primitive, because thatch is cheap, fast, local. It's what you use when you don't have an administrative supply chain delivering standardized tile. When the economic machine that once stamped its identity on every roof has loosened its grip. Inside there's a hearth, a pot in the hearth, maybe the last cooking before abandonment. And notice how small and brutal that detail is. Empires love to leave inscriptions. Ordinary life leaves ash. If you want the truth of what it feels like to live after the Great Age, you don't look for temples. You look for where someone boiled food. Now comes the confrontation that turns the trench into a philosophical weapon. This area sits outside the early Byzantine settlement previously identified through survey. That means this dwelling is either urban sprawl, evidence of a settlement expanding, or it's a later development after the main settlement was abandoned. Either way, it points to a landscape where boundaries are not stable, and boundaries are politics. A city's edge is where authority weakens first, where policing thins, where new people appear, where the old plan loses its monopoly. So Trench 1 becomes the site's diagnosis. A late chapter the team didn't know existed is suddenly vivid, and the job this season is clear. They must dig below these Byzantine foundations, cut through the demolition layers, and see what older city the late occupants were standing on, literally. Because here is the uncomfortable truth, Vlochos keeps forcing. Every new phase is built on someone else's ending. And the moment you acknowledge that, you can no longer treat walls and streets as neutral. They're not. They're choices. And now, with Trench 1 exposing the late afterlife of the city, Trench 2 becomes even more dangerous. Because if a humble house can hijack the geophysical narrative, what else is waiting to do the same? What happens when the hill answers the temple question with something that cannot be romanticized? If you want to understand what collapse looks like, stop picturing fire and screaming. That happens. But the more common collapse is quieter. It's a system that stops paying attention. Building 1 is exactly that kind of evidence. Not dramatic enough for a museum poster, but devastating if you know what you're looking at. A modest structure, 2 rooms, a hearth, everyday courseware, life reduced to essentials. And yet this small house might be the most honest witness on the site, because it forces a question that heroic narratives avoid. What happens to a city when the state that once organized it becomes distant, thin, or irrelevant? The Trench tells a story in 2 moves. First, a simple one-room building goes up in the early Byzantine period, roughly the 6th century CE. Likely mud brick walls, a tiled roof, the last echo of a standardized supply world. Then it's abandoned and begins to rot into the ground. Later, someone comes back. They don't level the area and start fresh. They reuse the foundations. They add a second room. They live inside the skeleton of someone else's earlier life. That is not a quaint detail. It's political economy. A foundation is labor already paid for. It is the kind of free capital you only get when you live among ruins. Reuse is what people do when they don't have surplus to waste on symbolism. It's what you do when the administrative center is far away, when military roads are less reliable, when coin and grain and tile don't circulate like they used to. And the roof difference matters more than it seems. In the later phase, the backfill lacks roof tiles, suggesting a thatched roof. That means something has changed in procurement. A tiled roof implies production, transport, and a market network that can support standardized materials. A thatched roof implies local improvisation, not because the people are less advanced, but because the system that once made the advanced thing cheap has weakened. This is the part of history that empire loves to erase. How the ordinary get forced into adaptation while the official story insists everything is stable. Inside the building, the hearth becomes the key. A hearth is not just cooking. It is governance at the domestic scale. It is where a household turns raw materials into survival. The pottery is coarse, everyday. No luxury tableware, no ritual deposit. Nothing that flatters your fantasy of a late antique town. Just the quiet evidence that people were here, eating, enduring, and then, at some point, leaving. The Trench team even allows themselves a human thought. Maybe that pot in the hearth was the last meal. Maybe. In a normal documentary, that would be the emotional beat. In this story, it's a warning. Because you can't sentimentalize that hearth without asking the harder question, why did they have to live like this here, on the edge of an older city, outside the main Byzantine settlement zone? There are 2 plausible readings, and both are unsettling. 1. This is urban sprawl. The settlement expanded beyond what earlier survey suggested. That means more people, more pressure, more need for space. But expansion is never neutral. Expansion implies someone had the authority to allocate land, or at least the ability to ignore old boundaries. 2. This is later development after the main settlement contracted or was abandoned. That implies fragmentation, small pockets of habitation in a landscape that used to be organized, a kind of archipelago of life among dead infrastructure. Either way, this building is a symptom of a system that has changed its priorities, and the larger historical context supports that tension. By the 7th to 9th centuries, the Byzantine state's grip over many inland areas becomes complicated by instability, shifting populations, and repeated disruptions. The center might still call itself Rome, but the question that matters at Vlochos is simpler. How far does that authority actually reach into this plane? Does it still tax effectively, protect reliably, repair roads, or does it mostly exist as a name carried by distant administrators? Here's the confrontational point. A state is only real where it can enforce something. Law, tax, protection, identity. If it can't, then the state becomes a rumor, and households become the real unit of order. And that's the moral inversion. Building one forces. Empires build walls to perform permanence. But it's the small house, mud brick, thatch, hearth, that tells you what permanence actually costs. It costs people living inside the leftovers of glory, making do with what the ruins allow, and calling that life. Now, the excavation strategy becomes almost philosophical, because the team is not only interested in this late chapter. They want what's underneath. They want the earlier phases, the Hellenistic city that geophysics suggested, the destruction layer that the roof tiles might mark, the sequence that explains why the settlement shifts its boundaries over centuries, like a wounded animal searching for a safer posture. And that means digging down through the demolition, through the messy mixed layers where time collapses into rubble. This is where the site becomes dangerous again. Mixed deposits are where your assumptions go to die. A roof collapse can masquerade as a street. A robbed wall can look like a foundation. A later house can sit directly above an earlier city plan, rewriting it without asking permission. So the team keeps peeling. And as they do, the ground begins to offer the kind of evidence that archaeologists both crave and fear. Concentrated collapse, tile after tile, forming patterns, hinting at a roof falling inward as if the building died in place. If that collapse belongs to the Hellenistic era, it's not just a structure. It is a moment when the city's promise failed. And if that's true, then the next question is unavoidable. What kind of failure turns a monumental urban plan into rubble that later people treat as a quarry, and eventually as a cemetery? Trench 2 is where the story reveals your bias. Because the trench isn't placed where it's comfortable. It's placed where the instruments screamed the loudest, on the hillside, on a steep angle, on a patch of ground that looks like it has been trying to slide off the hill for centuries. The geophysics showed a high reading here, a rectangular anomaly, the kind of signature that makes everyone's imagination reach for the same clean word: temple, shrine, ritual terrace, something monumental, something that would let us tell a satisfying story about why this city mattered. Notice what's happening. We want a sacred building because sacred buildings make the past feel orderly. They give you hierarchy. They give you purpose. They let you pretend power was spiritual instead of logistical. But the slope does not care what flat-screen archaeology promised. It cares about gravity, clay, and time. The team calls it the wildcard trench, and it earns that name immediately. The earth here is heavy. The gradient turns basic excavation into a physical argument. A trench that might have been a simple rectangle on paper becomes a narrow scar cut into a hillside that punishes every step. You're not just excavating, you're negotiating with risk, slipping, collapsing edges, hill wash that has carried centuries of material downhill and mixed it like a blender. That matters because hill wash is the enemy of easy narratives. It doesn't respect period. It doesn't respect clean contexts. It collects the leftovers of different centuries and drops them into the same soil, forcing you to work harder for truth than you wanted to. And in the first handfuls of spoil, the slope starts giving you the kind of evidence that doesn't flatter temple fantasies. A loom weight appears, small, pyramidal, the kind of object you don't put in a documentary trailer. But it is one of the most honest pieces of a settlement you can find, because it belongs to labor. It belongs to production. It belongs to a household economy that doesn't survive on speeches, but on cloth, trade, and routine. If this hillside zone were purely ritual, purely sacred, loom weights are not what you expect to meet first. Could it be an offering? Maybe. But the simpler reading is more confronting. Sacred spaces do not float above the economy. They sit inside it. Temples don't just require belief. They require materials, workers, maintenance, storage, and the quiet labor of people whose names do not survive. This is the first correction the slope forces. Even if there is a shrine here, it wasn't pure. It was supplied. It was managed. It was embedded in a system that extracted time and surplus from ordinary life. And then the weather turns. The team had joked about leaving the bad weather behind. The hill takes that as an invitation. Storms arrive hard enough to shut down work on the slope because it becomes too treacherous. Clay turns into a weapon. The trench becomes less an excavation and more a liability. This isn't just production drama. It is another reminder that archaeology is not storytelling. It is logistics. You can have the best hypothesis on Earth and still be defeated by rain. But even that is part of the site's deeper truth. Because ancient power worked the same way. Walls and terraces look eternal until you remember what they cost to build and maintain in a landscape that floods, erodes, and collapses. Every monumental structure is a wager against weather. When a city fails, sometimes it's not because the enemy breaks the gate. Sometimes it's because the system can't keep paying the maintenance bill. When the rain finally eases, the slope offers another piece of the political puzzle. A small coin from nearby Larissa, a modest denomination, but stamped with civic identity. Horse, nymph, symbols that say, this region is organized. This region belongs to an order. Coins like this don't just buy goods, they standardize allegiance. They turn a landscape into a network. Mints, markets, routes, obligations. And again, the site forces an uncomfortable thought. A city can disappear, but the machinery that once governed it leaves fingerprints in metal. Meanwhile, down in Trench 1, the excavation is hitting a different kind of density. Tile collapse, mixed deposits, phases stacked so tightly they begin to feel like a compressed moral record. The team starts to realize something that should make any historian uneasy. Much of what looked like walls and streets in the magnetometry might actually be roof tile collapse, not foundations, not neat plan, collapse masquerading as order. That is the second correction the site demands. Sometimes what we read as structure is actually failure. Then comes the kind of moment field archaeologists secretly crave because it carries the scent of certainty, something with letters. A shout goes up from Trench 1. Someone has found a roof tile with an inscription, just a few strokes at first, but enough to change the temperature of the entire project. Because if you can find a stamp, a name, a maker's mark that links this place to a known city, you don't just satisfy curiosity. You lock the site into the historical record. You force it to stop being anonymous. And anonymity is power. A nameless city is easy to romanticize, easy to forget, easy to loot, materially or narratively. But the moment you can name it, you resurrect responsibilities. Who governed here? Who taxed here? Who fought here? Who left? Who returned? Who buried their dead on someone else's ruins? So the slope keeps its secrets for now, and the team pivots to the tile. The hope is simple, that letters will finally do what walls cannot, make the past legally recognizable. But Vlochos has already shown you its character. It doesn't answer clean questions with clean answers. It answers the hunger for certainty by offering a fragment and daring you to claim you understand the whole. When the shout goes up, letters, you can hear the entire project's psychology snap into focus. Because inscriptions are not just information. They are authority. A stamped tile, a carved name, even two ambiguous characters scratched into clay. These are the closest thing archaeology gets to a witness willing to speak in court. A wall can be magnificent and still tell you nothing about who owned it. A coin can date a moment and still leave the place unnamed. But text can bind a site to the written world. Text can force the past to stop hiding behind maybe. That's why a small fragment of roof tile with a couple of letters suddenly feels game-changing. Not because the team has become sentimental, but because they understand the stakes. A name turns ruins into accountability. In Thessaly, that's especially sharp. This region is full of cities whose identities were once loud. Federations, leagues, rival centers, local cults, then became quiet as administrations shifted and archives died. Many sites have been securely linked to ancient names through inscriptions or strong literary correlations. Vlochos hasn't, and the difference between a Hellenistic city and this specific city named in records is the difference between atmosphere and history. So the tile fragment is treated with care, not because it's pretty, but because it might be a legal document in disguise. We watch the team restrain themselves. They don't declare victory. They talk about how this kind of find has worked elsewhere. A stamped tile found at a nearby site helped confirm it as the lost city of a known name. That's the model. That's the dream. A single artifact that anchors everything, walls, streets, phases, into an identity that can be cross-referenced. But Vlochos does what it always does. It offers hope and then forces humility. As the tile is fully exposed, no additional letters appear. The fragment remains stubbornly partial. The meaning stays ambiguous. It could be an abbreviation, a maker's mark, a count, a batch label. It could even be nothing more than a casual scratch that happens to resemble letters. And that ambiguity matters because it exposes a deeper truth about how power works through material culture. Most writing in an ancient city wasn't written for us. It was written for administration, for supply chains, for accountability inside a system that expected repetition. Roof tiles get stamped because someone controls production. Someone pays. Someone audits. Someone wants proof that this building belongs to a particular workshop, a particular contract, a particular authority. In other words, even a humble tile can be part of a bureaucracy. And that pulls us back to the big question in a more uncomfortable way. When the city's name is missing, what else is missing with it? Tax registers, property lists, court records, the kinds of documents that reveal who profited and who paid. Without those, it's dangerously easy to tell a beautiful story about Greek civilization, while ignoring the mechanics of coercion that made cities function. So the tile sits there like a half-spoken sentence. It is not enough to rescue the city from anonymity. Not yet. And right when the audience might start to feel frustrated, the site does something else. Something more brutal than ambiguity. Trench 2, the supposed temple trench, begins to turn into a different kind of evidence entirely. The team has been pushing through hillwash, chasing the terrace they hoped for, and the slope has been giving them mixed material. Loom weights, pottery fragments, the stubborn refusal to deliver the clean signature of monumental architecture. Then, near the end of a long day, they hit stone in a way that doesn't feel like a wall. Capping stones, a line, a shape that isn't construction, a grave, and instantly everything changes. Not narratively, ethically. Excavating human remains wasn't the plan, so work stops. Protocol begins. Authorities are contacted. Documentation requirements tighten. This is no longer just an excavation of structures, it's an excavation of a person. And once you cross that line, the site stops being a puzzle and becomes a moral encounter. This is where Vlochos stops flattering our curiosity and starts confronting it. Because temples are safe to romanticize, graves are not. Graves are what happens when the city's systems, its walls, its markets, its civic rituals, have already failed or transformed. Graves are what people do when they no longer trust the living to preserve meaning. So, they carve meaning into earth. The team is forced into urgency. There's no on-site security, and the exposure of human remains creates risk, looting, disturbance, disrespect. So, they decide, record everything and excavate before nightfall. Photogrammetry begins. Multiple angles. A 3D model stitched from images. The modern obsession with data becomes, briefly, an act of respect. If we must remove, we must preserve the record. Then, bone appears, fragile, crushed under centuries of pressure. A skull fragment, ribs, feet, a body that has been here while empires rose and shrank and forgot their own promises. And here is the moment the trench forces on you. We came looking for a temple because we wanted a story about gods. The hill gives us a story about people, not heroes, not kings, not names carved in stone, just a human being placed in the ground. East-west, no grave goods, a quiet form of faith that doesn't advertise itself with wealth. And that creates a new question more pressing than any inscription. If the hillside once held a sacred platform of the old world, Why are the dead of the New World being placed on it? They called it a wildcard trench as a joke. Then the slope turned it into a verdict. Because a grave is not just another feature. A grave is the moment the landscape stops being scenery and becomes a human contract. Somebody cut into this hillside on purpose. Somebody chose orientation, depth, stone lining. Somebody returned to this prominent place after the city's loud phases had already thinned, and decided the dead belonged here. And the most confrontational part is this: the grave doesn't care what your project plan was. Up until the first capstones appeared, Trench 2 was still being treated as a technical problem. The geophysics suggested a terrace. The team expected walls, platforms, maybe a ritual enclosure. They argued about rubble lines, the slope's terracing, hill wash that had mixed pottery across centuries. It was frustrating, physical, muddy. Archaeology doing what it does best, humiliating assumptions. Then the cutstone shows up in a shape that doesn't match architecture. It matches intention. Work stops. Not because the team is surprised, but because the ethics of the site changes instantly. A wall can be cleaned at your pace. Human remains cannot. This is where archaeology becomes law-adjacent, protocol, authority, documentation, responsibility. The ground has produced the one kind of evidence that forces you to slow down while also forcing you to hurry. No on-site security means exposure is danger. A grave opened and left overnight is a risk, disturbance, looting, disrespect. So the team has to do something uncomfortable and necessary at the same time. Excavate fast enough to protect the remains, but careful enough to keep the record clean. That contradiction is the real heartbeat of fieldwork, and it mirrors the contradiction of power itself. Systems demand outcomes, but bodies demand care. They call reinforcements. They coordinate across procedures, UK, Sweden, Greece, because even in death, jurisdiction matters. That's the part people miss. How the modern world re-enters the ancient world the moment bones appear. There are rules, and those rules exist because we've learned, slowly, often after abuses, that the dead are not a resource. They are evidence and dignity bound together. Photogrammetry begins before removal. The grave is recorded from multiple angles, so a 3D model can be stitched together later. This is not just for science. It's a kind of compromise. If you must dismantle the burial to understand it, you rebuild it digitally to preserve what you destroyed. That act alone should make you uneasy, because it proves the central truth of archaeology. We learn by undoing. Then the skull fragments appear, crushed under centuries of pressure. The bones aren't posed for drama. They're fragile. They are what time does to a human body when no one is maintaining the monument. In the trench, the team tries to read. The individual the way the soil allows. Robust frame, roughly 170, 100 centimeters. Adult, maybe, but not enough yet for biological sex. Nothing theatrical, just the reality that a person was placed here and then forgotten by systems that once promised permanence. And that is where the story turns confrontational, because it exposes what we really came here for. We came here hoping for a temple, because temples let you admire the past without guilt. Temples let you talk about belief and beauty. Temples let power look noble. A grave does the opposite. A grave forces you to ask, who had the authority to claim this slope for the dead? A grave forces you to admit that after the city becomes uncertain, the most stable act humans still perform is burial. Not conquest, not trade, burial. And the grave's silence is not neutral. It is structured. The orientation is almost perfectly east-west. There are no obvious grave goods. Those cues, handled carefully, not as absolute proof, lean toward early Christian burial practice, which immediately drags a massive historical shift into this trench. The replacement of older civic and cult landscapes with a new religious order that often reused the same spaces, sometimes deliberately, sometimes because the infrastructure was already there. And that brings us to the real question. Trench 2 has now forced into existence. Why here? If the hillside held a terrace platform from the Hellenistic era, if there really was a structure up here, maybe ritual, maybe civic, why would later people choose this exact spot to insert graves? Was it simply practical, taking advantage of an existing flat area in a hard slope? Or was there memory in the ground, an inherited sense that this was a set-apart place, a location already marked as special, already sanctioned by older power? This is where the psychology of complicity enters. Because when new regimes arrive, political or religious, they rarely build on empty land. They build on charged land. They take over the addresses of authority, not always by force, often by quiet administrative continuity. The same hill, the same visibility, the same natural superiority. So the first grave is excavated under pressure and recorded with care, and the team exhales like people who have just been handed responsibility they didn't ask for. There's relief, but it's not joy. It's the sober feeling of being brought close to someone who lived on the site long after the era that gets all the documentaries. And then the hill does what it always does. It refuses to stop at one. Because once a landscape becomes a burial zone, it rarely stays singular. A second grave appears, smaller. Then the suspicion forms, the kind of suspicion archaeologists learn to treat like a warning light. This may not be an isolated burial at all. It may be a cemetery. And if it is a cemetery, then the trench has stopped being a failed temple hunt. It has become something far more politically revealing. Evidence that long after the Hellenistic city's peak, long after whatever collapse left roof tiles in ruin, people returned to this slope to claim permanence in the only way they still could. Not by building walls, by planting the dead. The second grave is smaller, and that matters. Not because it's sad in a documentary way, but because it changes the scale of the claim being made on this hillside. One burial can be an exception, a family decision, a desperate act, a private grief cut into a public landscape. 2 burials start to look like a pattern. 3 is a statement. By the time the third grave emerges, the trench has earned its new name, Pandora's Box. Not because it's cursed, but because it refuses to return to the story we wanted. Every time the team tries to pivot back to terraces and monumental architecture, the ground insists on something more intimate and more politically revealing. Who gets placed here when the city's loud systems are gone? The graves share signals that push the conversation toward early Christian without pretending certainty. The east-west alignment, the lack of obvious grave goods, the plainness of the cut. In late antiquity and the early medieval centuries, these patterns show up often, especially when communities are adopting Christian burial norms that emphasize the body's orientation and reduce the display of wealth in death. But the team stays careful, because archaeology is allergic to overconfidence. Consistent with is not proves. A carbon date would help. Regional comparison would help. But even without a perfect label, the moral shape is clear. These burials belong to a world that is no longer the Hellenistic city at its height. And this is where the story becomes confrontational, because the post-Roman centuries are where we like to blur our eyes. We call them dark. We call them unstable. We call them transition. Those words are a kind of evasion. What they really mean is, the written record is thinner and power is more fragmented, so it becomes easier to erase ordinary lives. The Roman Empire collapses in the West, but the Eastern Empire, what we call Byzantine, continues for centuries. Yet, continuation is not the same as control. In a region like Thessaly, far from Constantinople, the question is practical. Does the state still reach here with administrators, tax collectors, soldiers, supply chains? Or does it reach here mostly as a name? An idea of authority that people may acknowledge, negotiate with, or ignore? This matters because cemeteries don't just reflect belief, they reflect governance. A cemetery implies a community stable enough to bury repeatedly in the same area. It implies land access. It implies some agreement, formal or informal, about where the dead belong. Even if the empire's administrative grip is weakening, something is still organizing space here. And if that something is not the distant state, then what is it? Local elites, a church network, kin groups, a settlement that has shifted its boundaries and is now using this slope as its margin, its quiet zone where the living stop and the dead begin. The bioarchaeology adds a second layer of discomfort. The preliminary assessments don't give us dramatic causes of death. They give us what most human life actually looks like: age ranges, robust bones, hints of wear. One adult appears over 30. A child is under 10. Another adult, still ambiguous in sex estimation, shows spinal degeneration similar to the first. Not a cinematic mystery, but the plain evidence of bodies that worked and aged. And that is where the story bites. If two adults show degenerative changes in the spine, what does that suggest about life here? Repetitive labor, load carrying, a daily economy built on physical strain, the kind of life that rarely gets memorialized in texts, because texts were written by people who could afford not to carry things. So when the team says, "The skeletons can still tell us a great deal," it's not a soft sentiment. It's an accusation against the archive. The written record has failed these people. The bones are what's left. And now the site's earlier layers start to press back into view. Because if this hillside is a cemetery in the early medieval centuries, then it is also, almost certainly, a reused place. The slope is not neutral ground. The geophysical anomaly wasn't invented. Toward the end of the season, the team begins to see traces of what they originally hoped for: a terrace, and above it, evidence of a collapsed roof. That matters because it suggests an earlier structure, likely Hellenistic, once sat here. Not necessarily a temple, not yet, but something built on a platform, something planned enough to leave a signature. Which brings us back to the most dangerous question of the entire excavation. Why would later burials be cut into the footprint of an older terrace? There are two answers, and both expose how power treats the past. The practical answer is cold. Terraces are useful. A built platform creates level ground on a slope. If you're burying people, and you want graves that won't slide or flood out, you choose the engineered surface left by an older regime. You don't need sacred continuity, you need stability. The psychological answer is sharper. People do not choose burial ground only for convenience. They choose it for meaning. A prominent place, overlooking the plain, already marked by old architecture, already set apart, that can carry memory even when the old religion is gone. The new faith may reject the old gods, but it still inherits the old geography of authority. New regimes rarely invent sacred landscapes from scratch. They occupy them. So the cemetery is not just a late phase. It is a claim layered on top of a claim. Death used to anchor belonging when the living world is shifting. And that finally forces the trench to reveal its philosophical purpose. The graves are not an interruption of the story. They are the story. They are what happens when a city's name fades, when walls become quarries, when the state's receipts stop being written, and ordinary people have to decide how to mark permanence with the only instrument they still control, where they place their dead. But we still haven't answered the question that makes Vlochos truly dangerous. If the terrace belongs to a Hellenistic structure, and the cemetery belongs to a later Christian community, then what happened in between? What kind of collapse, economic, political, or environmental, turns a monumental hillside platform into a silent graveyard? The most dangerous moment in archaeology isn't when you find something beautiful. It's when you realize your timeline was wrong. Because a wrong timeline doesn't just misdate a pot. It misidentifies the kind of power that shaped a place. It changes who you imagine living here, what you imagine they feared, what you imagine they could afford. It changes the entire moral geometry of the site. For most of the season, Trench 1 had been telling a plausible story. Late building above, earlier Roman phase below, a destruction layer with roof tiles that felt like a later collapse. It was tidy. It matched the instinct we always carry into multi-period sites. Late mess on top, earlier order beneath. Then Roman as the convenient middle layer because Rome feels like it's everywhere. Then the fine specialist does what specialists are paid to do. He takes the romance away. He looks at the diagnostic pottery from the destruction layer. The rims, the forms, the pieces that are not just pottery, but time-stamped habits. And he delivers the quiet correction that turns a whole narrative sideways. Those vessels are not Roman. They are Hellenistic. 3rd to 2nd century BCE. The roof tile collapse layer that everyone had been sliding into a later category is suddenly pushed back centuries into the very era when Vlochos was supposedly at its height. That is not a small revision. It's a betrayal of our comfort. Because if the collapse is Hellenistic, then this was not a late building failing in a declining world. This was a structure failing in a world that still had money, planning, and institutions. When the city grid below was active, when federal coinage circulated, when the landscape was integrated into regional systems, the question shifts from how did the city limp on after Rome to something sharper. What kind of fracture hits a place during its own peak? Now the roof tiles stop being background noise and become evidence of a specific kind of event. Roof collapses can happen slowly, sure, neglect, gradual decay. But a concentrated destruction layer with diagnostic material culture can also suggest a sudden abandonment or a disruptive episode, damage, demolition, a break in occupancy. Archaeology won't let you declare a cause without proof, but it will force you to admit the consequences. A building didn't simply fade, it ended, and its ending became a resource for later lives. And that brings us to the most politically revealing act humans perform in ruin: reuse. After the Hellenistic collapse, later phases do what later phases always do. They rob stone. They cut into old layers. They treat the past as a quarry because the past is cheaper than starting over. It sounds practical, and it is. But practicality is the mask power wears when it doesn't want to confess to erasure. Every reused block is a decision that says, your monument is now my material. Your memory is now my convenience. Then Vlochos adds a final insult to neat chronology. In the same general destruction context, the team finds small figurines, animals, a bird, a dog, a creature that looks like a fox meeting a dragon. And the specialist places them not in the Hellenistic period, but much earlier. The geometric era, hundreds of years apart. A time gap so large it should make the objects impossible. So what are they doing here? There are two possibilities, and both are uncomfortable. The first is the simplest: mixed deposits. Hill wash and later disturbance can drag older objects into younger layers. A site lived on for 1,000 years is a blender. Things move. Context gets complicated. The soil becomes a witness who has been punched too many times to remember events in order. But the second possibility is more human and more terrifying in its implications: curation. Imagine later inhabitants finding these older bronzes in the ground while building or farming. Imagine them recognizing that these objects come from before, from a time their own elders described in stories. Imagine them taking the figurines home, keeping them like talismans, decorations, or heirlooms of a past they didn't fully understand but refused to discard. Then imagine those curated objects getting caught in a later collapse, buried again, and waiting for us to dig them out centuries later. If that's what happened, then the figurines are not random. They are proof that memory doesn't require literacy. People can preserve the past without books, by keeping objects close, by letting old things live inside new houses. That is a quieter kind of history, and it's also a warning. Communities don't simply replace the past. They negotiate with it. They inherit it unevenly. They keep fragments. They bury fragments. They forget the names, but keep the shapes. This is where Vlochos stops being an archaeological puzzle and becomes an argument about power's most sophisticated technology: editing. Hellenistic urbanism is a kind of edit, turning landscape into legible order. Byzantine reuse is another edit, turning ruins into shelter. A Christian cemetery cut into a terrace is another, turning old sacred ground into new sacred ground, whether by intention or convenience. Every phase is a rewrite with a different editor, and the editors aren't neutral. They're responding to economy, to security, to belief, to what their system can afford. So when the Hellenistic destruction layer moves back in time, the entire site biography tightens into a more brutal sequence. A structured Hellenistic world builds on the slope. Something collapses or is dismantled. The remains are robbed and repurposed. Later, the dead are planted into the platform of the old world. And finally, Hillwash hides everything until we arrive with instruments and questions. But here is the unresolved pressure point. the open loop that now governs everything. If the terrace and collapsed roof belonged to a Hellenistic structure, what was it? A shrine? A civic building? A ritual complex tied to local cults? And if later Christians buried their dead on top of it, was that merely practical? Or was it the oldest political move in the world, seizing the address of the sacred to inherit the authority that once lived there? Once you accept that the terrace is real, the question stops being technical. It becomes psychological. Because a terrace is not just a platform. On a slope like this, a terrace is a decision to tame gravity. It's labor organized at scale. It's stone-hauled, set, and maintained so that something important enough, can sit above the city and look down. If Vlochos was a Hellenistic place that believed in order, then a terrace is order made physical, a flat statement carved into a moving hill. And at the end of the season, the trench finally begins to confirm what the geophysics had been whispering. Traces of a terrace, and on top of it, a collapsed roof. Not a fantasy. Evidence. A structure once stood here. It failed. Its tiles fell. Its stones were likely robbed. And then, centuries later, graves were cut into the same zone. That overlap is where the story becomes dangerous, because it forces you to confront a taboo idea. Sacred places don't die when religions change. They get reassigned. We like to tell ourselves that belief is pure and discontinuous. Old gods fall, new faith rises, everything resets. Landscapes don't work that way. Landscapes remember through visibility, convenience, and inherited awe. If a place was already marked as set apart, high, prominent, hard to ignore, people keep returning to it, even when they claim to reject what it once represented. So why would later burials cluster here? The first answer is pragmatic. Terraces are usable. A built platform gives you level ground in a terrain that fights you. If you're trying to cut graves into a steep hillside, you don't choose the worst place. You choose the place where older engineering already stabilized the slope. Even if you don't care about the old structure, you care about what it did to the ground. You care about the fact that it won't slide, that it drains differently, that it is easier to work. Practicality is often enough. But practicality isn't the whole story, because people do not bury their dead with the logic of carpenters alone. Burial is the one time ordinary people perform theology with their hands. Orientation matters. Placement matters. The presence or absence of goods matters. And in Vlochos, the cues, east-west alignment, no obvious grave goods, suggest a community that has adopted Christian norms. That means they weren't just dumping bodies here. They were making a statement about the afterlife, about resurrection, about belonging to a moral order that claims to transcend the old civic world. So, here's the harder possibility. They chose this spot because it was already loaded. Throughout the project, there are hints of cult life at the site, iconography tied to local Thessalian religious traditions, and regional identities preserved in coin imagery. Athena, Etonia, the Thessalian League, deities and symbols tied to the plane. Thessaly's sacred landscape was never only about pan-Hellenic Olympian gods. It had local cults with teeth, deities associated with horses, boundaries, protection, transition. Sacredness here was not abstract, it was territorial. A hillside terrace overlooking a city fits that logic. A shrine or small sanctuary here would have done what shrines always do in political landscapes. It would have legitimated the city's claim to the hill. It would have framed the urban plan below as not merely human engineering, but sanctioned order. When a city builds a sacred complex in a commanding position, it isn't only worship, it's governance through awe. Now ask what happens when that governance collapses. When the Hellenistic structure falls into ruin, its stones get robbed, its roof tiles collapse, and the site loses whatever institutional support once kept it clean and maintained. The official sacredness dies, but the place remains prominent. It remains separated from ordinary ground. It remains, in a quiet way, an address with history. Then later Christians arrive, not necessarily as conquerors with banners, but as people living in the afterlife of an older city. They inherit ruins, they inherit roads, they inherit walls that still perform dominance, even when nobody can fully explain why. And they face a choice that every new order faces. Do you ignore the old sacred geography, or do you occupy it? Occupying it can be as simple as burial. You don't need to build a church to claim a place. You can claim it by placing your dead there, by turning the hillside into a Christian necropolis. It is a profound form of territorial theology. This ground is now part of our story of salvation. This height now belongs to the new moral regime. If you're uncomfortable with that, good. You should be. Because it reveals how power behaves even when it claims to be purely spiritual. New religions often insist they are breaking with the past, but they also inherit the past's infrastructure of authority, its prominent locations, its boundary markers, its obvious sacred sites. They deny the old gods while moving into their addresses. And you can see how this resolves the tension of the trench. Trench 2 wasn't wrong to suspect a terrace and structure. It was wrong to assume that the structure would remain in its own time. The terrace likely began as Hellenistic architecture, possibly ritual, possibly civic. But its afterlife became a cemetery. That is not an accident. That is how landscapes are governed, not by wiping the slate clean, but by writing over what is already visible. Which brings us back to the big question we posed at the beginning. When power dies, who inherits the ground? And who gets to rewrite the dead? At Vlochos, the answer is beginning to form, but it isn't complete yet. Because to resolve it, we have to admit something modern viewers rarely want to hear. It isn't only empires that rewrite the past. Ordinary communities do it too, through reuse, through burial, through the quiet claim that this place is ours now. The difference is scale, not method. And then the story throws one final, brutal mirror at us. Because Vlochos doesn't end as an ancient tale. It collides with the present. After filming, catastrophic floods devastated Thessaly. The team witnessed the chaos. The local population suffered enormous loss. And suddenly, the whole question of who owns the ground stops being metaphor and becomes a lived emergency. Because nature does what empires do. It reorders the landscape, and the people below pay the bill. So before we close the ledger, we have one last act to face, where the ancient layers and the modern disaster merge into the same indictment. Empires love a clean ending, a last battle, a final decree, a ceremony where power transfers like a crown passed from one head to another. Vlochos gives you something uglier and more honest. Power doesn't end, it stratifies. A hilltop wall built to dominate a plain, a planned city laid out below it. A terrace cut into a slope to host something important, ritual, civic, sacred, the exact label still pending. Then collapse, roof tiles fallen inward, a destruction layer sealed with Hellenistic pottery that drags the end backward into the very age we like to call the peak. Then, the long afterlife, stone robbed, foundations reused, a Byzantine house living off the skeleton of older order, roofs shifting from tile to thatch as supply chains thin and the state's reach becomes a rumor. Finally, graves, east-west, quiet, no display, cut into the same hillside where an older structure once performed authority. That sequence is not just history. It's a political philosophy written in dirt, because each layer answers the same question with a different kind of violence. Who owns this ground? The wall answers with intimidation. It doesn't defend so much as it declares hierarchy. Top and bottom, inside and outside, protected and exposed. The Hellenistic city answers with administration, grids, streets, property order, the disciplined geometry of governance. The destruction layer answers with a rupture. Whether sudden or gradual, it marks a moment when the city's promise failed, and failure became material. The Byzantine house answers with adaptation, survival built from leftovers, life narrowed to hearth and courseware when grand systems no longer guarantee stability. The cemetery answers with the most final claim humans can make. We belong here so completely that even our dead will stay. Now we can finally resolve the big question. When power dies, who inherits the ground? And who gets to rewrite the dead? At Vlochos, the answer is brutal, because it's ordinary. Whoever arrives next, whoever can use the land, repair it, reframe it, or bury into it, becomes the inheritor. Not because they're morally right, because they're present, because they can act, because their needs become the new law. And rewriting the dead isn't only something empires do with propaganda. Communities do it too, sometimes gently, sometimes without even noticing. When you reuse an old foundation, you are rewriting the meaning of the structure beneath your feet. When you quarry stone from a collapsed terrace, you are rewriting a monument into a resource. When you cut Christian graves into the footprint of older architecture, you are rewriting sacred geography, whether from convenience, memory, or a quiet territorial instinct that predates theology. That is the philosophy of power the Hill teaches. Control is not only conquest. Control is continuity of use. Whoever keeps using a place gets to define what it was. And archaeology is dangerous precisely because it interrupts that privilege. Archaeology forces a later world, our world, to admit that the ground was never blank, never innocent, never purely heritage. It was always contested property, always layered claims, always people paying for someone else's permanence. So when we romanticize ancient Greece as marble and ideas, Vlochos answers with a ledger written in maintenance and collapse. When we romanticize Christianity as pure rupture from paganism, Vlochos answers with a cemetery set into an older terrace, new belief inheriting old topography. When we romanticize decline as a cinematic fall, Vlochos answers with a thatched roof and a hearth, life continuing in smaller, harsher units after grand systems retreat. And then, because history is not polite, Vlochos drags you back to the present. After the season filmed here, Catastrophic floods devastated Thessaly. People lost homes. Lives were destroyed. The team witnessed the chaos. The plain that looked tranquil in the opening shot revealed what it always was: a landscape that can change hands overnight, sometimes by armies, sometimes by states, sometimes by water. This is the final confrontation. Nature does what empires do. It rearranges the ground, and the people below pay the cost. So if you want a neat moral, you won't get one. You'll get a responsibility. The wall, the city grid, the terrace, the roof collapse, the house, the graves, none of it survives by virtue. It survives by circumstance and by the choices of the living. And the most honest way to honor the dead at Vlochos is not to turn them into content, or to force them into a single heroic narrative. It is to let the layers remain what they are: evidence that power keeps trying to overwrite human life. And human life keeps leaving traces anyway, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.